The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as Judge Richard Lawrence took his seat, adjusting his robe with his usual air of authority. Another day, another trial, another defendant who, in his mind, was already guilty before the jury even spoke. Then, the door at the back of the courtroom swung open. A woman walked in, poised, confident, completely unfazed by the weight of the room. She wasn't a lawyer, nor a defendant. She moved with purpose, her sharp gaze scanning the space like she was evaluating it. Judge Lawrence smirked, barely hiding his amusement. "And you are?" he asked, his tone laced with condescension. The woman reached into her pocket, pulled out a badge, and held it up for all to see. "FBI Special Agent Naomi Bennett." The murmurs stopped. The judge's smirk vanished. And in that moment, the entire courtroom realized, this trial was about to take a turn no one saw coming, The courtroom was filled with the usual buzz of voices as people settled into their seats. Lawyers shuffled through their notes, the prosecutor whispered something to his assistant, and the court clerk organized the files on her desk. It was another routine day in Judge Richard Lawrence's courtroom, at least, that's what he thought. Judge Lawrence was known for his sharp tongue and dismissive attitude, especially toward those he considered beneath him. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers impatiently against the bench as he waited for the next case to begin. That was when his eyes landed on a young black woman standing near the defense table. She was tall and poised, wearing a well-fitted black blazer and matching trousers. Her long black hair was tied neatly into a ponytail, and her sharp eyes scanned the room with an expression that was unreadable. She carried herself with an air of quiet authority, yet there was something about her that made Judge Lawrence smirk. He cleared his throat, drawing the courtroom's attention. Well, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "And who do we have here? Another law student trying to play attorney?" A few people in the audience chuckled, and even the prosecutor smirked. The woman remained unfazed, her expression neutral as she turned her attention toward the judge. "No, Your Honor," she replied calmly. "I'm here on official business." Judge Lawrence raised an eyebrow, clearly entertained. "Official business? You do realize this is a courtroom, don't you? Not some community center." More quiet laughter rippled through the room, but the woman didn't react. Instead, she slowly reached into the inner pocket of her blazer. The bailiff took a step forward, but she held up a hand to stop him, moving carefully and deliberately. Then, she pulled out a badge. The laughter died instantly. The polished gold emblem glinted under the bright courtroom lights as she held it up for everyone to see. "FBI Special Agent Naomi Bennett," she announced, her voice steady. A heavy silence filled the room. Judge Lawrence blinked, his smirk disappearing in an instant. He leaned forward, narrowing his eyes as if he hadn't heard her correctly. "FBI," he repeated, his voice quieter now. Naomi nodded once, tucking the badge away but keeping her gaze locked on him. "That's correct, Your Honor. And I am not here as a defendant, a witness, or even an attorney. I am here to observe." The tension in the room shifted. People whispered among themselves, exchanging wide-eyed glances. The prosecutor, who had been grinning moments ago, now sat stiffly in his chair. Even the bailiff looked surprised. Judge Lawrence cleared his throat, clearly thrown off balance. "Observe, what, exactly?" Naomi tilted her head slightly. "Federal investigations have flagged concerns about judicial misconduct in this courthouse," she said. "Specifically, cases involving potential bias and abuse of power." A stunned murmur spread through the room. The judge's fingers gripped the edge of his bench tightly. His jaw clenched. "Bias," he repeated, his voice strained. "Are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Naomi interrupted smoothly. "I'm simply here to gather information." Judge Lawrence didn't respond right away. His once relaxed posture had gone rigid, and his face had lost its earlier amusement. He glanced toward the prosecutor, then back at Naomi. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar creeping into his chest. It wasn't anger. It was fear. The tension in the courtroom was thick, the weight of Naomi's words pressing down on every person in the room. Judge Richard Lawrence sat frozen for a moment, his confident smirk completely erased. His fingers gripped the edge of the bench as he studied the woman standing before him, trying to assess the threat she posed. Naomi Bennett didn't flinch under his gaze. She had dealt with men like him before, men who used their authority as a shield, who thought their power made them untouchable. But the difference between them and her was simple: she wasn't afraid. Judge Lawrence finally forced a laugh, though it was far less convincing than his usual smug demeanor. "An FBI investigation," he said, shaking his head. "I find that hard to believe. If the federal government had concerns about my courtroom, I'd imagine they would have sent someone a little more experienced." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the room, but no one was truly laughing anymore. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The jury, though silent, exchanged wary glances. Naomi remained still, her face unreadable. "Experience has nothing to do with the facts, Your Honor," she said smoothly. "The truth doesn't need age to be valid." Judge Lawrence's lips pressed into a thin line. He had underestimated her. His usual tactics, sarcasm, intimidation, making people feel small, weren't working. He glanced at the bailiff. "Bennett, was it?" "Well, Agent Bennett, unless you have an actual case to present before this court, I'd suggest you take a seat and let us get back to real legal matters." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "I'm afraid I can't do that, Your Honor." Silence. Judge Lawrence exhaled sharply. "And why is that?" Naomi stepped forward, her hands clasped neatly in front of her. "Because the case I'm here for is already in progress." She turned slightly, glancing toward the defense table, where a man in his late 30s sat in a worn-out suit. His name was Darius Collins, and he had been accused of burglary, a crime he swore he didn't commit. Naomi's gaze locked onto him, then flicked back to the judge. "This trial. Right here. Right now." Judge Lawrence let out a forced chuckle, but his unease was obvious now. "You're joking." "I don't joke about people's lives, Your Honor." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. The tension had shifted from shock to something heavier: anticipation. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. The prosecutor, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke up. "Your Honor, this is highly unorthodox. This is a state matter. What jurisdiction does the FBI have here?" Naomi turned her attention toward him. "The jurisdiction of ensuring that justice is actually served," she replied. "Federal reports indicate that Judge Lawrence has a pattern of disproportionately harsh sentencing against Black and Latino defendants. Darius Collins' case was flagged as a potential miscarriage of justice." The prosecutor's face paled. "That's absurd. This trial has followed procedure." "Procedure isn't the same as justice," Naomi countered. "And if your case is as strong as you claim, then you should have no issue with me reviewing the proceedings." Judge Lawrence clenched his jaw. He could feel the room slipping away from him, control slipping through his fingers. His name, his authority, his reputation, was she really threatening to tear it all down in front of a packed courtroom? His voice hardened. "This is my courtroom, Agent Bennett." Naomi's expression didn't change. "Not anymore, Your Honor." The judge's knuckles turned white against the bench. The courtroom was watching. The press was watching. He had to tread carefully. "Fine," he finally said, his voice tight with restrained anger. "You want to observe?" "Observe." He leaned forward, forcing his signature smirk back onto his face. "But don't expect to find anything." Naomi met his gaze without blinking. "Oh, I don't expect," she said calmly. "I know I will." And for the first time in his career, Judge Lawrence felt something he had never truly felt before. Powerless. The atmosphere in the courtroom had changed. The energy was different now, heavier, more charged. Judge Richard Lawrence sat stiffly in his chair, his smirk long gone, replaced by a carefully controlled expression. He could feel Naomi Bennett's eyes on him, watching his every move. It was unsettling. Naomi remained standing near the defense table, her posture straight, her presence undeniable. She had made it clear, she wasn't here as a passive observer. She was here to investigate, and everyone in the room knew it. "Proceed," Judge Lawrence finally said, his voice clipped. The prosecutor, Daniel Reynolds, stood and smoothed down his expensive suit, attempting to regain control. He glanced briefly at Naomi before focusing on the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "let's not allow distractions to take away from the facts of this case. The evidence against Darius Collins is overwhelming." Darius, the defendant, sat quietly, his hands clasped together on the table. He had dark circles under his eyes, the kind that came from sleepless nights filled with fear. "The defendant was found near the scene of the burglary," Reynolds continued. "His fingerprints were discovered on the property's back door, and a witness, Mr. Garrett, the homeowner, positively identified him as the man who broke in." Naomi tilted her head slightly. She had read the case file before stepping into this courtroom. The prosecution had built their argument on circumstantial evidence, and something about it didn't sit right. Tom Harris, Darius's court-appointed attorney, slowly stood, looking far less confident than Reynolds. He cleared his throat. "Your Honor, the defense maintains that Mr. Collins was in the wrong place at the wrong time. His fingerprints were found on the back door, but not inside the house. That's because he was leaning against it while waiting for his rideshare to pick him up. He never entered the home." Reynolds let out a scoffing laugh. "And we're supposed to believe that?" He turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, the defendant has a criminal record. He's been arrested before for petty theft. Are we really supposed to think this was all just some big misunderstanding?" Naomi's jaw clenched. There it was, the real reason Darius was on trial. Not because of the evidence, but because of who he was. She took a deep breath before stepping forward. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady but firm, "I'd like to request a review of the forensic evidence presented in this case." Judge Lawrence glared at her. "Agent Bennett, this is highly irregular." "Not as irregular as sending a man to prison based on assumptions," Naomi interjected, her eyes locked on his. "The prosecution has painted a picture of Mr. Collins based on his past, not on the facts. I'd like to hear more about the fingerprint analysis. Specifically, why there are no prints inside the home, only on the exterior." Reynolds looked annoyed. "Because he was wearing gloves," he said matter-of-factly. Naomi raised an eyebrow. "Is that speculation, or do you have actual evidence proving that?" Reynolds hesitated. Judge Lawrence sighed, rubbing his temples. "This is not an FBI investigation, Agent Bennett. This is my courtroom, and I will not have you derailing this trial." Naomi remained unfazed. "Then let's talk about the witness," she continued. "Mr. Garrett claims he saw Darius Collins that night. But I read his statement. He admitted that he saw a black man near his house. He never gave a detailed description. And yet, somehow, that was enough for an arrest?" Reynolds frowned. "He identified him in a lineup." Naomi turned toward the jury, speaking as much to them as she was to the court. "A lineup where Darius was the only black man present." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. The jurors shifted in their seats. Judge Lawrence banged his gavel. "Enough. This is not your case to argue, Agent Bennett." Naomi took a step closer to the defense table. "And yet, I'm the only one questioning it." The courtroom fell silent again. Darius turned to look at her, a flicker of hope in his otherwise defeated expression. Judge Lawrence clenched his jaw. He had spent years ruling his courtroom without being questioned. But Naomi Bennett had just made something painfully clear. For the first time, someone was questioning him. And she wasn't going to stop. The courtroom had become a battlefield, and Naomi Bennett had just fired the first real shot. Judge Richard Lawrence sat stiffly in his chair, gripping the gavel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not in his own courtroom. Naomi remained standing, her posture unwavering, her eyes locked onto the judge's. She knew she had just made herself a target. She had challenged the integrity of the court in front of a full audience, including the jury. But she didn't care. She had seen too many cases like this, ones built on shaky evidence, racial bias, and a system that was more interested in convictions than the truth. Judge Lawrence exhaled sharply. Agent Bennett, I will not allow you to turn my courtroom into a spectacle. Naomi didn't blink. With all due respect, Your Honor, it already is one, just not for the reasons you think. A few whispers rippled through the audience. Even the jurors shifted uncomfortably. The prosecutor, Daniel Reynolds, stood abruptly, his frustration barely concealed. Your Honor, this is absurd. We are in the middle of a trial. Agent Bennett is not part of the defense. She has no standing here. Naomi turned toward him, her voice calm but razor-sharp. No, I'm not part of the defense. But I am part of an ongoing federal investigation into judicial misconduct and wrongful convictions. And right now, I see a case that raises a lot of red flags. Reynolds clenched his jaw, clearly thrown off. This case has been thoroughly investigated. The jury will decide based on evidence, not because of outside interference. Naomi smirked. That would be true if there was any real evidence. She turned back toward the judge. Your Honor, let's look at what we actually know. The prosecution is claiming Darius Collins committed this crime because 1. He was found near the scene. 2. His fingerprints were on the exterior of the house. 3. A single witness, who never gave a full description, claimed he saw him. She let that sink in for a moment before continuing. But what about what we don't know? Where's the surveillance footage? Where's the physical evidence connecting him to the crime? If he was wearing gloves, where are the gloves? Reynolds exhaled sharply. The jury has all the evidence they need. No, they don't, Naomi cut in. What they have is a narrative. One that's based more on Darius Collins' past than on facts. Judge Lawrence slammed his gavel down. Enough! His voice boomed through the courtroom. Agent Bennett, I will not tolerate further disruptions. If you have official business here, file the proper motions through the federal court system. Otherwise, I suggest you sit down and allow these proceedings to continue. Naomi held his gaze for a long moment. She could see the veins in his neck tightening, the way his fingers twitched as he gripped his bench. He was angry. Good. Because that meant she had hit a nerve. She inhaled deeply, then stepped back, nodding. Understood, Your Honor. But I'll say this, if this case ends in a conviction based on faulty evidence, you can be sure the FBI will be reviewing every decision made here today. Judge Lawrence's expression darkened, but he didn't respond. Reynolds, looking increasingly uneasy, cleared his throat. Your Honor, I'd like to continue questioning the witness. Judge Lawrence hesitated before nodding. Proceed. As the trial resumed, Naomi took a seat behind the defense table. She had made her point, for now. But she wasn't done. Not even close. The tension in the courtroom hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown stronger, like a storm brewing beneath the surface. Judge Richard Lawrence sat stiffly in his chair, his jaw tight, his grip on the gavel firm. He was trying to pretend that nothing had changed, that this was just another case under his control. But Naomi Bennett had made sure everyone in the room knew that wasn't true. She sat behind the defense table now, but she wasn't just observing, she was watching, waiting, calculating. She knew that the moment she had exposed the weaknesses in the prosecution's case, the trial had shifted. The jury had started to listen in a way they hadn't before. Daniel Reynolds, the prosecutor, tried to regain his footing. He turned toward the jury, smoothing out his tie as if that would help him regain control of the narrative. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, despite what Agent Bennett has suggested, the truth remains the same, the evidence against Darius Collins is overwhelming. Naomi folded her arms, tilting her head slightly as she listened. Reynolds wasn't adapting, he was doubling down, hoping the jury would ignore what she had just exposed. He turned toward his key witness, Mr. Garrett, the homeowner who had identified Darius as the suspect. Garrett, a man in his late 50s with neatly combed gray hair, sat in the witness stand with his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Mr. Garrett, Reynolds continued, can you confirm once again that you saw the defendant, Darius Collins, near your house the night of the burglary? Garrett nodded quickly, as if eager to prove his importance. Yes, sir. I saw him with my own eyes. Reynolds gave the jury a confident look. And there's no doubt in your mind that it was him? No doubt at all, Garrett said firmly. Naomi's fingers tapped lightly against the table. That was a lie. She knew it. And now, she had to make sure everyone else in the courtroom knew it too. Tom Harris, the defense attorney, stood up. His voice was steady but cautious. Mr. Garrett, he said, flipping through his notes, can you describe exactly what you saw that night? Garrett straightened in his chair. I looked out my window and saw a man near my back gate, moving around suspiciously. Harris nodded. And you immediately recognized him as the defendant? Garrett hesitated. It was slight, but Naomi caught it. Well, I mean, it was dark, Garrett admitted. But I saw him. I know it was him. Harris raised an eyebrow. Did you get a good look at his face? Garrett hesitated again. I saw enough. Enough? That wasn't proof. That was an assumption. Naomi could feel the shift. The jury was watching more closely now. The cracks in the prosecution's case were becoming more visible. Harris didn't press too hard, but his next question was sharp. Mr. Garrett, you originally told the police that you saw a black man near your house. But you didn't give a detailed description, did you? Garrett's face turned slightly red. Well, no, but... And yet, Harris continued, stepping forward, when the police brought you in to identify a suspect, Darius Collins was the only black man in the lineup. The room went silent. Even Judge Lawrence shifted in his seat. Garrett swallowed hard, glancing toward the prosecution table as if looking for help. Reynolds quickly stood up. Objection. The defense is twisting the facts. Naomi leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with Judge Lawrence. She didn't say anything, but she didn't have to. He could feel her watching him. Lawrence hesitated, then sighed. Overruled. Answer the question, Mr. Garrett. Garrett's hands tightened in his lap. I was sure it was him. Harris nodded slowly. But you never actually saw his face clearly, did you? Garrett hesitated again. No. Murmurs rippled through the jury. Naomi let out a slow breath. There it is. The entire foundation of the prosecution's case had just cracked. Judge Lawrence could feel it too. His grip on the gavel tightened, his expression unreadable. But Naomi saw something flicker in his eyes, fear, Not of her, but of what was coming next. The weight of the revelation hung in the air like a thick fog. The jury members shifted in their seats, their faces a mixture of uncertainty and discomfort. Judge Richard Lawrence adjusted his glasses, trying to maintain his usual air of control, but Naomi Bennett could see the tension in his jaw. He knew what was happening. The prosecution's key witness, Mr. Garrett, had just admitted, under oath, that he never actually saw Darius Collins' face clearly. His entire testimony was built on assumption, not fact. And that assumption had put a man on trial. Prosecutor Daniel Reynolds was quick to regain his composure. He stepped forward, buttoning his suit jacket as he addressed the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, while Mr. Garrett's testimony may not be as precise as we'd like, let's not forget that this case isn't built on one piece of evidence. He turned toward the jury, his voice smooth. The defendant's fingerprints were found at the scene. That alone is enough to prove his presence. Naomi expected this. She had already studied the forensic report, and she knew exactly where the fingerprints had been found. It was not inside the house, where the burglary had occurred. It was on the exterior gate, a detail the prosecution conveniently failed to emphasize. She didn't wait for Tom Harris, the defense attorney, to counter. Instead, she stood up, her voice firm. "Your Honor, I would like to request that the forensic analyst be recalled for further questioning." Judge Lawrence looked at her sharply. "Agent Bennett, this is not your trial. You do not dictate the proceedings." Naomi met his glare with unwavering confidence. "With all due respect, Your Honor, this is a federal investigation, and I am here to ensure that justice is served. If the prosecution wants to use forensic evidence as their strongest argument, then we need to examine it properly." Lawrence hesitated, his fingers tapping against the bench. He was cornered. If he denied her request, it would only raise more suspicions. If he allowed it, he knew the trial could fall apart completely. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he sighed. "Fine. The forensic analyst will be recalled for further questioning." Naomi sat back down, satisfied. Reynolds, however, was visibly frustrated. He whispered something to his assistant before stepping back. The bailiff left the courtroom, and within minutes, the forensic analyst, Dr. Evelyn Carter, returned to the witness stand. She was a middle-aged woman with sharp features and an even sharper intellect. Naomi had read about her before. She was respected in her field, known for her precise work. Which meant she would tell the truth, whether the prosecution liked it or not. Tom Harris stood up, holding a copy of the forensic report in his hands. "Dr. Carter, can you confirm where exactly Mr. Collins' fingerprints were found?" Dr. Carter nodded. "Yes. His prints were discovered on the exterior gate of the property, specifically on the lower portion of the metal bars." Naomi leaned forward slightly. "And were any of his fingerprints found inside the house?" Dr. Carter shook her head. "No, they were not." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Naomi could see the jurors exchanging glances. Harris continued. "Dr. Carter, in your professional opinion, does the presence of fingerprints on an exterior gate prove that someone entered the property?" Dr. Carter adjusted her glasses. "No, it does not. It only proves that the individual touched the gate at some point." Naomi spoke up again. "Dr. Carter, based on your findings, would it be possible that Mr. Collins was simply leaning on the gate or passing by rather than breaking into the home?" Dr. Carter hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Yes, that is entirely possible." More murmurs. Naomi saw Judge Lawrence shift uncomfortably. He knew the case was unraveling before his eyes. Prosecutor Reynolds quickly stood. "Objection, Your Honor. This line of questioning is leading the witness." Judge Lawrence hesitated before banging his gavel. "Sustained. Agent Bennett, I suggest you remember your place in this courtroom." Naomi met his glare, but she didn't push further. She had already won this round. The jury was listening. The truth was out. As Dr. Carter stepped down from the witness stand, the weight in the room was undeniable. The prosecution's most solid piece of evidence had just been discredited. Naomi glanced toward Darius Collins. For the first time since the trial began, he looked like he had hope. She wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The courtroom felt different now. The weight of uncertainty had shifted, and the momentum was no longer in the prosecution's favor. Naomi Bennett could see it in the jury's expressions, in the way some of them now avoided looking at the prosecutor, Daniel Reynolds, directly. She could see it in the way Judge Richard Lawrence sat tensely in his chair, his usual smug authority now replaced with something much closer to unease. He knew what was happening. They all did. The prosecution's case was unraveling piece by piece. Naomi sat with her hands clasped on the table, watching as Reynolds tried desperately to regain control of the situation. He turned toward the jury, his voice a touch more urgent now. "Ladies and gentlemen, I urge you not to get distracted by theatrics, he said, forcing a confident smile. Let's focus on what we do know. The defendant, Darius Collins, was found near the scene of the crime. His fingerprints were present. And while some may try to poke holes in our case, the fact remains, this man has a criminal record. Naomi's eyes darkened. There it was. The unspoken truth behind this entire case. Darius wasn't on trial because of solid evidence. He wasn't here because the justice system had done its due diligence. He was here because of his past, because, in their eyes, a man with a record was always guilty until proven innocent. She saw the way Darius tensed in his seat, his hands curled into fists on the table. He had been fighting against this his whole life. Naomi took a slow breath and stood up. Your Honor, she said, her voice steady, I request that the court review the full details of Mr. Collins' criminal record before the prosecution continues using it against him. Reynolds scoffed. His record speaks for itself, Agent Bennett. Naomi didn't even look at him. She kept her focus on Judge Lawrence, forcing him to meet her gaze. Does it? She asked. Because I have reviewed it, and I think the jury deserves to know exactly what kind of criminal record we're talking about. Lawrence hesitated. He could deny her request, but doing so would only make it look like he had something to hide. And right now, the last thing he needed was more suspicion. After a long pause, he sighed. Proceed. Naomi turned to the jury. Let's be clear about what's actually on Mr. Collins' record, she began, picking up a file from the table. The prosecution has repeatedly referred to it as if it proves he's a dangerous criminal. But here's what the record actually shows. 2011, arrested for shoplifting a pack of bottled water. Case dismissed. 2013, arrested for littering outside a convenience store. No charges filed. 2016, arrested for unpaid parking tickets. Fined, case closed. 2018, arrested for disorderly conduct after a verbal altercation with a police officer. Later proven that Mr. Collins was not the aggressor. Case dropped. That, Naomi said, closing the file, is the criminal record the prosecution is so eager to use against him. The courtroom was silent. Naomi glanced at the jury, letting the reality sink in. Not one of these incidents involved violence. Not one was a felony. Not one of them has anything to do with the crime he's being accused of today. She turned to Reynolds, her expression sharp. So tell me, how exactly does this record prove he's guilty of burglary? Reynolds' jaw tightened. He had no answer. Judge Lawrence shifted in his seat, his fingers drumming against the bench. He had spent years presiding over cases like this, dismissing concerns like Naomi's without a second thought. But this time, things were different. Because this time, someone wasn't letting it go. Naomi took a step closer to the jury, her voice calm but unwavering. Mr. Collins is not on trial for his past. He is on trial for this case. And so far, we've seen no physical evidence placing him inside the home. No DNA. No surveillance footage. No stolen items found in his possession. She turned to face the jury completely. Ask yourselves this, if Darius Collins looked different, if he had a different background, would he even be sitting at this table right now? The room was silent. Judge Lawrence shifted again. Naomi saw it, the flicker of discomfort in his expression. He didn't like what was happening. Because for the first time, his control over the courtroom was slipping. And he knew there was nothing he could do to stop it. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Naomi Bennett could feel the weight of her words still hanging in the air. The jury sat frozen, their expressions no longer neutral. She had done what she came to do, she had forced them to see the truth. Judge Richard Lawrence shifted in his chair, his fingers drumming anxiously on the bench. He had spent years running his courtroom the way he saw fit, shaping the narrative, ensuring that people like Darius Collins never stood a real chance. But this time, things had unraveled too quickly, too publicly. And now, for the first time in his career, he wasn't in control. Prosecutor Daniel Reynolds cleared his throat, his confidence visibly shaken. He knew the case had fallen apart, but he still had to pretend. He straightened his tie, turned to the jury, and forced a smile. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's not forget the facts here," he said, but his voice lacked the power it once had. "Regardless of what Agent Bennett has suggested, we cannot ignore that Mr. Collins was near the scene of the crime. His fingerprints were found on the property. And the victim, Mr. Garrett, believes he saw the defendant." Naomi stood before Reynolds could say another word. Believes she repeated, her voice calm but sharp. "Belief is not evidence. Facts are evidence. And the facts in this case don't add up." Judge Lawrence sighed, rubbing his temple as if the weight of the trial had finally caught up to him. He knew what was coming. Naomi turned toward the jury one last time. "Darius Collins has been sitting at this table, fighting for his life, while the prosecution builds a case on assumptions. But assumptions don't make someone guilty." She took a step forward. "Ask yourselves this: if Darius wasn't the one who committed this crime, will you be able to live with the fact that you sent an innocent man to prison?" A long silence followed. And then, Judge Lawrence let out a heavy sigh. He straightened in his chair, his hands folding neatly in front of him. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, his gaze flicked toward the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice quieter than usual, "have you reached a verdict?" The foreperson, an older woman with sharp eyes, stood. She swallowed hard, glancing toward Darius before nodding. "We have, Your Honor." The room felt like it had stopped breathing. Judge Lawrence gestured for her to proceed. The woman cleared her throat. "On the charge of burglary, we find the defendant," she paused, exhaling deeply before continuing, not guilty, A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Darius didn't move at first. It was as if his body refused to believe the words. Then, slowly, his shoulders dropped, his eyes filling with something Naomi recognized all too well, relief mixed with disbelief, Sarah, Darius' sister, let out a quiet sob from the gallery, her hands clasped tightly together as if in prayer. Naomi turned toward her client, offering a small, reassuring nod. Judge Lawrence pursed his lips, his displeasure barely concealed. He tapped his gavel against the bench. "The defendant is free to go." It should have ended there. But Naomi wasn't finished. She stepped forward once more, locking eyes with Judge Lawrence. "Your Honor, with this verdict, I'd like to request a formal review of previous convictions under your jurisdiction." A murmur spread through the room. Judge Lawrence stiffened. "This isn't necessary," he said sharply. Naomi tilted her head. "Isn't it? How many other men like Darius Collins have stood in this courtroom with the odds stacked against them? How many were convicted without real evidence?" Judge Lawrence clenched his jaw, but he said nothing. Naomi turned toward the jury. "Justice doesn't end with one case. It starts when we acknowledge the mistakes that came before it." Judge Lawrence's fingers gripped the gavel tightly, but he didn't argue. He couldn't. Not anymore. Naomi let the moment settle before finally stepping back. She turned toward Darius, who was still staring at her in quiet gratitude. "You saved my life," he murmured. Naomi shook her head. "You saved your own. I just made sure they listened." As she walked out of the courtroom, she knew this wasn't over. There were so many more cases like this. And she would keep fighting. Because this was just the beginning. The ending of this story is more than just a victory for Darius Collins, it's a reckoning. It's about holding a broken system accountable and forcing people to confront the uncomfortable truth that justice isn't always served fairly, and that many, like Darius, have been condemned not by evidence, but by bias. What makes this ending so powerful is that it doesn't just stop at one man's freedom. Naomi Bennett doesn't walk away satisfied with a single acquittal because she knows this is bigger than one case. She challenges the system itself, demanding a review of past convictions, refusing to let the cycle of wrongful incarceration continue. And Judge Lawrence? His silence in the final moments speaks volumes. He represents an old system built on unchecked power and prejudice, one that is finally being questioned. For the first time, he isn't the one in control. Naomi is. What I love most about this ending is its realism. It doesn't paint a fairy tale where corruption disappears overnight. Instead, it acknowledges that change is a fight. That the system doesn't fix itself, it has to be forced to change by people like Naomi, people who refuse to stay silent. This isn't just the end of a trial. It's the beginning of something bigger. A movement. A shift. A moment where justice is no longer just a word, it's a demand. And that, in my opinion, is the most satisfying ending of all.